Journeys with Jeff again. Welcome to another show. We are going to, those of you who watched the last one, saw these three ladies from the village of families and children, Catherine and Ashley and Jennifer. We have joining them two people you have met before, if you've watched the show. To my left is Iran Nazario. He is the CEO of the Peace Center of Connecticut. And to his left is Dan Blanchard, who you might remember. He's an educator at New Britain High School and publisher of several books. And both of these, just to fill you guys in, these three ladies here are practitioners of children, dealing with children and adults who have had trauma. And you guys remember the story of Iran and Dan. Both of these gentlemen, as youngsters, as children, infants, and through their childhood, experienced some very, very, very serious trauma to what these ladies deal with. And I just thought it would be interesting to just turn it over to the five of them to have a little bit of a panel discussion and just have them share, swap back and forth and share what they have to tell us all. Iran and Dan, you guys want to? Iran, you want to just kind of refresh everybody's memory, tell a little bit about your childhood, and then Dan, and then we can all jump in.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me on again, and thank you all for being here. As I mentioned in the previous show, I was born and raised in the city of Hartford, and I arrived in the city of Hartford due to child abuse and neglect on behalf of my father in New York. So the transition from New York to Connecticut kind of happened forcefully, where my mother was being abused while she was pregnant with me, and my father was abusing my little brother, or my older brother. And she had suffered a broken eye socket, broken jaw, some broken ribs while she was pregnant with me. And she had to have kind of like an emergency C-section for me to be born here in the city of Hartford. So she came here under duress. She came here under traumatic situations, which I know these many years later had impacted me greatly. After she gave birth to me in Hartford over at St. Francis Hospital, she became addicted to opioids, drugs, and a number of other things that kind of changed the path of her life, but also changed mine. So I went from being abused, what I call inside the womb, to being abused not only by neglect, but by her own traumatic experiences. I think my mom, knowing what I know now, used to take the opportunity she had when she was drunk or et cetera to punish me mostly because I looked most like my dad. So it was this thing of her reliving through my face and what I looked like, the experiences she had with my father. So she would take the heel of her shoe and beat me upside the face, trying to change my figure and trying to change the way I look. So as a child, I had many holes in my face, and I learned that anger and love meant pain. So for me, I ended up hurting a lot of people through the process, and we can get into that later on. But again, my existence and my birth all the way through 5 or 6 years of age, I experienced a heavy load of abuse from adults and a lot of traumatic experiences that I went through. I normalized. So again, I'll get into more of what I did as an adult to people because of what I thought I knew. So
thank you, Iran. Dan, you want to just a brief summary to the audience?
Jeff, thank you. And I'll just kind of summarize real quick some of the things that we talked about before. And while me and Iran were outside talking, we found that we've got a lot in common, a real lot in common. I, too, was born in Hartford, very rough neighborhood, dysfunctional home, born into poverty, an abusive alcoholic father who I think was self-medicating to deal with his own mental health issues. And he was a violent man. And, and there was like no reasoning with him. So there were many nights where, I and my family, I had 6 other brothers and sisters. experienced all sorts of things that that no kid should have ever experienced. And you go through that, and your formative years, your first 7 years of life or so, first 10 years of life, and it kind of makes you feel broken, and it makes you feel angry. And that anger led to a lot of street fighting and a lot of dysfunctional things that I was doing and that my brother was doing. But I was lucky, as I'd mentioned in the previous time I was here, Jeff, I was lucky that I was able to find sports and able to transform a lot of that stuff that I was failing and doing into sports. And not that that solved all the problems. It didn't, because I had moved at this time. We'd moved to East Hartford, and but the problems were still there. We were in a different neighborhood, but I still had the abusive alcoholic father, who sometimes even tried to keep us from playing sports. And still the late night beatings and all that stuff went on for many, many more years. But I thank God that I was able to find something to latch onto, which was sports. And back in those days, when you played sports, you usually had a very big, strong, very loud, very tough coach, who was usually fair, but very, very firm. And I think that was real good for me back in those days. And those coaches kind of don't exist anymore. They're shunned today, those coaches. But that kind of coach back in that time was very good for me, because it gave me something to work toward. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan. And that brings us to the focal point of what I would hope this discussion might focus on, and that is these two gentlemen here, early on in their lives, had some of the most horrendous experiences that you can imagine, but both of them did a 180. Both of them were able to transcend their previous experiences, and that's what I would like to focus on now, for you guys to have a discussion on what happened. What is it that happened, whether psychotherapeutically or in your environment? What changed that made it possible for you two guys to become a CEO of a Connecticut Peace Center, an educator, an author of 5 books? I'm going to just kind of bow out and let these guys just talk about it.
Well, I mean, if I could kind of start with answering a little bit of that question. I mean, this was a process that took a lot of self-reflection and a lot of forgiving of oneself, and to developing the tolerance that you have, not only for what people do to you, but what you do to you. Because the realities are that you blame yourself for many of the things that happen to you, and until you're not ready to release that blame and also forgive those who hurt you, it's almost impossible to take the next step and find ways to heal yourself. Especially when I was diagnosed with a stress impulse disorder, and I was diagnosed with the inability to focus and all these things when I finally went to therapy. One of the things that I realized about stress impulse disorder was that it was stress-induced, right? So for me, I lived and functioned really, really well in a stressful situation. So when I finally hit the streets at the age of 11, and I was homeless for a number of years on the streets, that was my environment, because there was a lot of stress there. So for me, that was home. And stress allowed me to punch somebody and be okay with it. Stress allowed me to do all these things. Again, I know all these things later on, but the stressors continue to be present, and for me, that became part of home. And so for too many years, by the age of 27, I was still in gangs. I was still doing a lot of things, but that was my life. That was my circle. That was my area of strength. And when you become someone that's very willing to hurt someone else, you become the perfect candidate for the gangs that I was in, because now I can be used as a tool of injury, threat, pain, and all that. And I thrived on that, because I was taught by my dad. Too many times I encountered with my dad. I was taught by my mom. Then I was taught by the streets that this was the type of environment that I was most successful in. People were looking up to me because I was able to hurt someone at a drop of a hat, and that was the perfect skill set to have in a certain environment on the street. So this was very difficult. Therapy, for me, only came into play when I was going to federal prison, where they do an assessment of your mental status to determine how much time the judge should give you, but whether or not you have some outlying circumstances that they should deviate from the sentencing guidelines and all that stuff. So that's the only real reason I ever went to therapy and found out what was wrong, or found out what was right, or found out what I could do or could not do. And it was via a pastoral counselor, because I was embarrassed to go see one of these people for services, so I had to do it quietly inside the back of a church where no one can see me because my boy's in the hood. That wasn't acceptable. And to the ladies that I was trying to impress, I was weak because of that, and depending on where we were, that wasn't acceptable. So it took a long, long time of not only receiving the first dose of therapy, but also then after that understanding more and more through other people I met with in the prison system that I was able to make that change.
So two important things, Iran, that stand out to me is that you got into a setting where you could begin the process. There were people out there, resources out there. In this case, a pastoral counselor, even though you did it through the prison system, but there was some resource out there that helped you begin the process of dealing with this. Number one, and number two, this is not a thing where you're going to snap your fingers and boom, you're abracadabra, you're healed. It's it can be a long, difficult process. Dan, do you agree with that?
I do, Jeff, and I've never been to therapy, but sometimes I think I probably should. If anything, just to get a better hold of who I am and what I can do to be, to take my game to the next level. And for me, I don't have an easy answer on what made me successful. There's a lot of different things that kind of maybe worked in unison, and maybe some of it was luck. Although I'm not a big promoter of luck, I'm always trying to change people's definition of luck to preparation, meeting opportunity, and creating your own luck that way. But maybe there is like a little luck out there anyways, when multiple things are spinning at the same time, yet they interconnect and they somehow come together to help you. So for me, there was a couple things. One was anger, helped me. Another was mentors, but very non-traditional mentors, helped me. And I'll explain these in a moment. And the third thing was, I don't know how I was able to do this, but I was able to recognize what I did not want. So I was able to look at my life and see like what my father was doing and the life our family was living. And I was able to say like, I did not want that life. I was able to do that. So let me back up and tell a quick little story on anger. I coached high school wrestling and many, many different facets of wrestling and ages of wrestling for about 14 years. And there was one day, I saw this boy, his father was always riding him. He was a great judo competitor, and he was wrestling for me, and a good wrestler. Wrestling's a little bit different than judo, but he was a good wrestler, and he came in, he had these black fingernails on, and I was like, hey, I just want to ask you, what's going on with the black fingernails? And he goes, I'm an angry young black man. And I said, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. You can use that. And he looked at me kind of surprised, because here's a boy that's been rebelling against his father, and his father wrote him a lot. But I'm like, you can use that anger. You can channel that anger as like unending energy to create a better world, create a better life for yourself, and thus a better life for the ones that you hang around with or surround yourself with, and thus maybe at least a small circle of the world. You can use that anger. That anger gives you energy. That anger will help you get up at 5 in the morning or 4 in the morning or whatever it is when you've got that anger driving you toward a goal of creating a better life for yourself. That anger will help you stay late and do more than everybody else. That anger, I know, that anger like used to help me win a lot of street fights. Used to help me win a lot of wrestling matches where I became a 2-time junior Olympian wrestler. And then later on I became a 2-time junior Olympian wrestling coach. And I remember looking at my wrestlers and going, why can't they just win? Like I did, just get mad and win. You know what I'm saying? But then I found out it just wasn't that easy. So what's another thing that's going on here? It's not just the anger, tapping into the anger and funneling the anger to create a better, more successful life. But there's something else has to be in your life. And that's like, relationships with those big, strong, tough coaches. Mentors have to be in your life. People who are looking out for you and really care for you have to be in your life. And when people always ask me, well, you must have had some good mentors along the way, I always go, well, I kind of had like non-traditional mentors. I wasn't smart enough to know that I had to go get mentors. So I kind of had like non-traditional mentors. And my mentors were like the great athletes I watched on TV and then reading their books about what they did to become successful. You know, the great coaches I had growing up. Those were all like non-traditional mentors. It wasn't like I seeked them out and said, hey, I'm trying to do this. Can you help guide me and all that? That never happened. I never had like your traditional mentor. The public library was my mentor. And like I said, very non-traditional mentors. So if you get these things and you get throw a few people in the mix who care about you, even if they're screaming at you to do more push-ups, you know, or whatever it is, but they care about you. You know, some good things can happen, and then if you recognize the things you don't want. And I remember as I was growing up, and as a teenager and as a young man, sometimes I'd be talking to my sisters, or I'd be talking to, let's say, my fiance, or became my wife, and they'd be like, well, what did Dad tell you to do? And I'd be like, well, he told me to do this. And they'd be like, so what are you going to do? I'm like, well, I'm going to do the opposite. You know, because I know what I don't want. You know, and the opposite may be a little messed up too, but I'm going to take my own little road and learn my own little things because I know what I don't want. And now I've got like 5 kids that, you know, I can't squeeze them tight enough. You know what I'm saying? And my boy is going to high school, just out of the blue, kisses me and tells me he loves me. I don't remember, he does that regularly. I don't remember ever doing it to my father. Never.
Yeah. Well, Dad, you bring up an important point, which is where Catherine and Ashley and Jennifer come in at this juncture. Something somewhere along the journey of your life, somebody or bodies got involved and became your mentors or change agents, if you will, for helping you guys. And this is sad to say, this is probably a couple of stories that you guys have heard all too often. What do you guys do, Catherine and Jennifer and Ashley, when you have people who have had? How do you act as their change agents? I mean, you use your training and your background in psychotherapy. How does it work with these guys?
So I'll say that at the Village, we really try to do it in a multifaceted way. So we certainly have therapists who are trained in trauma treatment, who can work with children, their parents, adolescents, families, right, through evidence-based treatment models to try to help to work through some of that trauma. We also do a lot of work when you think about resilience, and I listen to the stories of these 2 gentlemen. We also do a lot of work trying to transform systems so that systems become more trauma-informed and can support people like Iran and Dan. Because if they're in school and the teacher doesn't understand them, thinks they're just trying to be, you know, a pain to the teacher in the moment versus coming from a place of compassion and understanding, oh, what's really behind this behavior, right? Then things can change. So we do a lot of work in schools trying to help change that culture. We do a lot of training all around the state with surrogate parents, with ministers to understand the impact of trauma. And then I'll let these 2 talk about some of the things they do specifically in the programs they work in.
Thank you for hitting the bullseye.
It is that multifaceted, right? It's that connection with one caring person. It's things like sports, areas that children, adolescents can feel like they can contribute, they can be successful, they're part of a community, all of those kind of things.
Ashley, Jennifer?
I think I was going to say, you know, thank you both for sharing your stories, and I think it's a really amazing example of resiliency and all of the talk that we do at times to people to see examples of the positive connections that people have, whether it was the pastor when you were in the prison system or your coaches, for people that watching that have that chance to have that positive interaction may mean, you know, that's who they are and that's what they do, but how much that means to somebody else. One of the things that I talk a lot about is, you know, if you're getting treatment in our setting, is not only somebody that's really, you know, knowledgeable and knows what they're doing, but the connection they have to you as a person. So being able to really meet somebody where they're at. If they're not wanting to dive into therapy and tell their story, meeting them at the level that they're ready to just build that relationship with you, so that when you're needed and when they're ready, you're there. And I think that that's a lot of what I talk to our clinicians about, is that somebody that says, I don't want to come here, I don't want to be here, I don't want to talk to you, but they show up every week, that's something. That's building that relationship, that you're there for them, you're a constant person for them. And they could say they don't like you 4 times, and you say, I understand, but I'll be here next week.
Jennifer, jumping over to you from what Ashley just said, I remember reading, I think it might have been Van der Kolk, some study that indicated that various psychotherapeutic models were really not as relevant, as powerful an impact on the person's behavior as Ashley very beautifully pointed out, as the interaction, so that the other person says, I feel validated, I feel like I'm seen, I feel like I'm being heard. Mm-hmm. And that counts a lot more than whatever model they're plugged into. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I was listening to Ashley, and I'm listening to you, and I'm like, oh, you're taking the words right out of my head, because you're correct. We use the relationship to kind of create a safe place, like a therapeutic healing environment for the person to be able to kind of tell their story at their own pace, and to do it where we give them hope. We're able to identify their strengths and help them to see strengths where they did not previously see it. And so it's almost like recreating redefining a new kind of view of themselves and a new identity of themselves. So that's kind of how we use therapy, irregardless of the model that we use.
You know, I think one of the hardest things for young people, and I can speak to that angle myself from having had exposure to different people, is the weirdness of that first interaction. Mm-hmm. Because when you're born and raised in an environment with toughness, ego, power, muscles, the ability to win a fight or whatever the case might be is, the top of where you want to reach. To have someone try to come at you or talk to you with a compassionate mindset doesn't register right away. Mm-hmm. Because at the very least, the most fearful place is within yourself, and the most fearful place is the heart that you want to protect against injury and pain. So I always say the furthest distance in the world is between here and here, because you use your brain so much to block what's here. So for me, it wasn't really about the first crack at therapy. Again, this was a mandated thing the court had you do. It was more a long-term connection with someone who decided that I was a priority, and not a priority in the way I wanted to be only, but in a way where they had certain set-up rules similar to a coach, and they had a structure that I desperately needed. So I look for structure in the gang, I look for structure out on the street, I look for structure in a lot of areas, but the weirdest interaction was that first, I care about you. What? Shut up. You don't care about me. Or I'll be there later on. No, I don't want to talk to you later. Or, hey, I love you. What? Shut up. I don't want to hear about love or anything like that. It was really me fighting against what was unfamiliar. And when I realized what that other side was healthier for me, that I was no longer really looking over my shoulder for my enemies, but I had somewhere I could bounce those things off. I started squeezing my fists a little less. I started attacking people a little less. I had more resilience and more tolerance for people saying things. We were talking about that pre-interview over here. In the green room is what I understand it's called. While we were there, we were really talking like brothers. And the facts are that a stranger connected with me at a level where, because we had similar stories, but it was more about hearing each other out. That doesn't happen day to day. It happens over years and years. And to me, the work that you do is important when you understand the client base needing to have that break from you, because we just don't understand why you want to talk to me. Like, what are you looking for me? I mean, when you are out there, it's always self-preservation. Let's win. How can I win? How can I dominate? How can I be victorious? And you're taking in a sense, we feel like you're taking our power from us because we can't dominate. But domination is really about getting better, and that's one of the things that we
Ashley
have to learn.
and Jennifer, let me ask you guys a question about what Iran was just saying. As the process begins and he begins to clench his fists less often, he begins to lighten up a little bit. The inner landscape, the emotions begin to change. What's going on in neuroscience, in the neuroscience, chemical, physiological changes in his brain? What's going on during this time? Is it beginning to reconfigure itself?
Want to go first, Ashley?
No, I was going to say, and I don't want to speak for what's happening in your thoughts, but as your body starts to realize that the threat is going less, the systems take over. For your heart rate might go down a little bit. You won't breathe as heavier. Your muscles are not as clenched and ready to fight, and that's just an innate process that happens in a split second when our bodies realize that the threat is no longer there. We're no longer in danger.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, they're very interesting. I'm getting the signal, 2 minutes. I hate that. Let me just close by saying to you guys out there, please, if you find this important to share with other people, if you think this is worthwhile sharing or knowing more about, call the station, WHC-TV, Nutmeg TV, our Hartford Public Access. I want to ask you guys a question real quick, so people, while we're closing for the people. Somebody might be watching and they might be looking at you two guys, and they might be using you guys as examples to justify their own judgmentalism by saying, these two guys were able to turn it around, so I'm going to sit as judge and jury, and anybody who hasn't done it, it's because of their own lack of effort, because of their own laziness. What would you say to a person? How would you respond to a person who said, Dan and Iran, I'm using you guys as examples to justify my own judgmentalism? What would you say?
Well, I'd like to tell you, Jeff, that has happened to me a bunch of times. People have said, people, especially people that knew me when I was young, have said, well, Dan pulled himself up by his bootstraps, so why can't the rest of them? And I've always said that it's always a nature-nurture thing. It's never one side. It's never one side. It's always a nature-nurture thing. And if you think about how many people haven't been able to, or maybe haven't been given the chance to, whatever terminology you want to use. But if you think about how many people just haven't climbed that ladder to become more successful, to start their own business, to write books, win awards. If you think about how many people haven't, it's a very, very high number. You think about it. So there's got to be something to that. It's not as simple as people are trying to make it. Yeah. It's much, much more complex. And a lot of things have to happen simultaneously for this to happen. And like I said, and every now and then, even though I'm going to say it again, I do preach against luck, but every now and then I have to say, maybe every now and then I did get a lucky break. Every now and then all the other things were going right, and I was able to funnel that anger and do a lot of things through that anger to become successful. And I made it.
Iran,
but most don't.
Most don't. That's important. Iran, what would you say to somebody who said, Iran Nazario is my excuse and justification for clinging to my judgmental attitude toward people? What would you say to that person?
Well, I would say just the number, 500 homicides. I've responded to over 500 homicides in one city. And the facts are that those people never got an opportunity to make that change in many situations. So the reason I use a number is because although I am here and Dan is next to me, the journey to healing is a long one. And it takes a number of factors, as you mentioned, to get you there. So I would say to you, have the tolerance and the patience that you want someone to have with you.